A still courtroom, hushed except for the soft scraping of shoes on tile, until one overzealous officer storms in and rips a gold necklace right off a teenager's neck. He thinks he's flexing authority. He has no idea the silent woman at the bench is the boy's mother and his judge. What begins as public humiliation explodes into a reckoning that turns the entire room upside down. Stick around. You won't believe the twist that follows. The morning light filtered through pale curtains in a modest Glenwood Springs home, painting the walls in soft, hopeful hues. 16-year-old Xavier Thompson stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the collar of his crisp white dress shirt. His heart fluttered, not from nerves exactly, but from the weight of what today meant. Xavier wasn't wearing his usual hoodie and jeans. Today demanded something more. For his own peace of mind and for the memory of the man whose face he carried in every careful movement. Around his neck hung a simple gold chain, the kind you'd hardly notice, except that Xavier never let it out of his sight. That chain had belonged to his father, Michael Thompson, a firefighter who sacrificed his life to rescue 3 children from a burning house when Xavier was just 12. In the ashes, that necklace had been the only thing recovered, bent, scorched, dragged through devastation, then carefully restored by Xavier's grandfather. To Xavier, it wasn't jewelry. It was a lifeline to a legacy of courage and love. Today, he both needed it and feared what it symbolized. "Ready?" came a deep, steady voice from the living room. Xavier turned from the mirror to see his grandfather, Samuel Thompson, standing by the front door. At 68, Samuel carried himself with measured dignity, broad shoulders still straight from decades of railroad work, weathered hands gripping a carved walking stick, and a fedora perched firmly on his silver hair. A Vietnam veteran and retired conductor who'd seen more than his share of injustice, Samuel believed in firm handshakes and plain-spoken truth. Xavier met his grandfather's calm gaze. "Ready." "Remember," Samuel said, voice low and resolute, "your head stays high. You're not here to beg. You're here to stand." Xavier nodded, the chain cool against his chest. "I know." The ride to the courthouse was quiet, the old station wagon humming along Highway 6 as morning traffic drifted by. They didn't speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because words felt unnecessary. Xavier stared out the window, watching the Rocky Mountains loom in the distance, their snow-tipped peaks a stark reminder that beauty and danger often shared the same space. He took in the chill air pouring in through the cracked window and let it steady his thoughts. Samuel sat beside him, cane leaning against the seat, eyes on the road ahead. Every so often he'd shoot a glance at his grandson, encouraging, unwavering. He'd been through his own battles with the system, seen friends and neighbors judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. Today, it was Xavier's turn to navigate those halls. At the courthouse steps, they paused. The building rose before them like a fortress, gray stone pillars, heavy wooden doors, metal detectors vigilant at the entrance. It was a place where authority ruled unquestioned. Until now. Inside, Xavier and Samuel joined the others in the long wooden pew just outside Courtroom 2B. The air was frigid, as if every bit of warmth had been squeezed out by the weight of legal precedent. Attorneys in tailored suits hurried past, clutching files. A janitor mopped in near silence. Anxious defendants whispered to their lawyers. Through it all, Xavier sat with his back straight, hands folded in his lap, but his fingers kept drifting to the chain, tracing its familiar grooves. No one asked about it. No one cared, or so it seemed. Then, across the marble floor, something shifted. Xavier felt it before he saw it, a pair of calculating eyes locking onto him. That look, a mix of superiority and suspicion, was unmistakable. He glanced down at the chain again, as if its warm weight could shield him. Samuel caught the glance and squeezed Xavier's knee, his silent signal, "Stay calm, stay focused." Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered sheriff's deputy emerged into the hallway. He was Officer David Collins, 40 years old, with a rigid posture and a jaw set as if he were perpetually clenching something under his breath. His polished badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, letters spelling Collins in capital authority. He moved slowly, deliberately, every bit the man who believed his uniform made him untouchable. When Collins' gaze settled on Xavier, it narrowed ever so slightly, as if this 16-year-old didn't belong in his jurisdiction. Xavier felt the intensity of those eyes, felt the air thicken around him. He said nothing, sat unmoving, the chain a quiet counterpoint against his white shirt. Samuel noticed Collins's approach and shifted in his seat, cane at the ready, not for attack, but for support. He knew how quickly a calm scene could become something else entirely in these halls. Collins stopped a few feet away, looming over Xavier like a scarecrow in a storm. He leaned in, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the cold air. "You waiting for something?" he asked, tone accusatory. Xavier looked up, met the question with measured respect. "My hearing," he answered, voice firm. "On the locker incident." Collins' eyes flicked to the chain as though he'd just spotted contraband. "What's that around your neck?" he muttered, more to himself than to Xavier. Xavier's chest tightened, but he remained steady. "My dad's," he said. "He wore it when he saved those kids." The deputy snorted, stepping even closer, closing down Xavier's space. "A nice story," Collins said, shaking his head, "but in here we deal with facts, not family heirlooms." Samuel stood at once, cane tapping against the floor, his voice low but commanding. "That chain belongs to my grandson. You'll show some respect or you'll answer for it." Collins glanced at Samuel but refused to back down. He turned back to Xavier. "Let's see it." With that, he reached forward and, without warning, grabbed the chain, jerking it violently away from Xavier's neck. The gold plating scraped against Xavier's skin with a sharp sting. The clasp groaned, then snapped. Time slowed. Xavier's breath caught in his throat. The chain dangled in Collins' hand, swinging like a pendulum of power. Gasps rippled through the hallway. Lawyers paused. A bailiff stepped forward, ready to intervene. But the deputy ignored him, eyeing the chain like a trophy. "That yours?" Collins muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You sure it wasn't lifted off someone else?" The moment was raw and public, an exclamation point on every assumption placed on Xavier's shoulders. His grandfather's eyes flashed with outrage, but he said nothing. He had taught Xavier to choose battles wisely. Xavier's jaw clenched. He forced himself to speak, voice hoarse but clear. "Give it back." Collins smirked, flicking the chain in front of Xavier's face. "We'll see about that," he sneered. Then, casually, as if he were discarding trash, he tucked the necklace into his duty belt pouch. Xavier sat frozen, the emptiness at his throat echoing in his chest. Around them, the courthouse murmured, some in shock, some in grim acceptance, others looking away as if it had nothing to do with them. Samuel rose, voice firm and echoing off the marble walls. "You will return that chain, now." It wasn't a suggestion. At that command, something in the deputy's smirk faltered, but he merely shrugged, turning away as if dismissing a bothersome fly. Samuel stepped forward, hand on his cane. "This is public property now," he said. "Everything is under watch." Collins made a move toward the courtroom door, still clutching the chain. "Lock it in evidence," he called over his shoulder. "If it's his, we'll give it back when it's verified." With that, he strode away, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The hallway, once oppressive, suddenly felt electric. The first crack in the courthouse's veneer of unquestioned authority. Xavier's fingers trembled as they reached for the empty space on his chest. The chain was gone, but what it represented. The legacy of his father, the protection of his family, the dignity he refused to sacrifice, remained unbroken. Samuel placed a gentle hand on Xavier's shoulder. "Stay steady," he whispered. "They just lit a fire they can't put out." And as they stepped toward the courtroom door, Xavier realized that his quiet presence and the chain he carried had already begun to shift the balance. Today wasn't just about a misunderstanding at school. It was about a young man learning that sometimes you stand your ground not by raising your voice, but by refusing to let the world steal what's rightfully yours. And when that moment comes, you'll want every second of it on camera. Because accountability comes from being seen. The hall outside courtroom 2B felt colder than the chill of early spring, as if the polished marble walls themselves had drawn in every last scrap of warmth. Xavier straightened in his seat, eyes forward, palms pressed lightly against the smooth wooden bench. Every so often his fingers brushed the cool gold link at his collarbone, the only tangible connection to his father, the firefighter who'd given everything to protect others. Today that small chain felt like his sole claim to humanity, in a place that reduced him to a case number and a stereotype. Beside him, his grandfather Samuel Thompson sat silent and watchful, cane resting between his knees. Samuel's broad shoulders were steady, but Xavier could see the tension coiled in the knuckles of his right hand. He'd been waiting to see how this courthouse, this bastion of blind justice, would treat a black teenager wearing a keepsake that meant everything to him. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Xavier's heart rate picked up, not because he feared the judge, his mother, Judge Celia Thompson, would preside with measured fairness, but because he sensed the approach of someone determined to flex power. Lawyers and paralegals zipped past, papers rustling. A court clerk's soft chatter drifted from down the corridor, and then the shuffle of heavy boots, slow and deliberate, cut through the symphony of courthouse life like a guillotine. Xavier felt the heat rise at the back of his neck. He glanced at Samuel, whose gaze had narrowed toward the approaching figure, Deputy David Collins. Barely 40, Collins was a fixture in the Glenwood Springs courthouse, known for a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for overstepping boundaries when he thought he held the upper hand. That badge on his chest read Collins in bold letters, as if he were announcing his authority to the world. Collins's eyes locked onto Xavier, and the rest of the hallway seemed to fade away. Xavier sat motionless, his grandfather's unspoken warning to stay calm and carry himself with dignity, echoing in his mind. A ripple passed through the other waiting defendants. Some stiffened, some looked away, but all sensed the gathering storm. The deputy's gaze traveled slowly from Xavier's polished shoes to the gold glint at his throat. Collins took a measured step forward, his shoulders squared and arms uncrossed in invitation to conflict. Xavier kept his chin level, breath controlled, focusing on the weight of the chain beneath his shirt. It had survived fire and debris. It could withstand this moment, too. Collins stopped a few feet away, close enough for Xavier to feel the warmth of the deputy's breath. "You here for the Walker hearing?" he asked, voice low but sharp, as if challenging Xavier to contradict him. Xavier met his eyes. "Thompson," he said evenly, "it's a misunderstanding at school. My lawyer said it'd be quick." Collins sneered, glancing from Xavier to Samuel. "Sure," he muttered. "Looks more like you're here to show off." Samuel's cane tapped against the floor, a staccato punctuation that made the deputy's smirk falter for a heartbeat. "He's here to defend his rights," Samuel said, voice calm but imbued with steel. Collins rolled his eyes and looked back at Xavier. "Right." He reached inside his jacket pocket and produced a small notepad and pen. "Your ID," he said, extending a hand. "Let me see it." Xavier's fingers tightened on the chain's clasp. He drew his breath in and produced his student ID and a court summons from his pocket. Collins snatched them, flicked through the papers without reading, then tossed them back. "Name check's out," Collins said, voice flat. "But that chain, what's it worth, kid? Couple $100? Xavier swallowed past the lump in his throat. "It belonged to my father," he said. "He wore it when he rescued those children from the fire." Collins scoffed. "Sounds like a fairy tale." He stepped even closer, his tone shifting from casual to menacing. That chain could be evidence in a number of crimes. You ever think of that? Stolen goods, possession of hot property. Anyone could make a call and say it belongs to them. The air between them crackled. Xavier's fingers gripped the bench edge. His grandfather's hand settled on his shoulder, a reminder, be still, be strong. He met Collins's glare. I'm not selling it. I'm not hiding it. It's mine. Collins's lips twitched into a smirk. We'll see. He dropped the notepad into his pocket and rubbed his thumb over the chain's pendant, eyes narrowing. Don't move. Then, as if bored with the confrontation, he took an abrupt step back and folded his arms, leaned against a marble column. I'll be watching. Xavier exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His heart pounded, not with fear but with adrenaline. His grandfather let out a soft, controlled sigh. That's him, Samuel murmured. All bark, no bite. But if he tries anything, you let me handle it. Xavier nodded, voice steady. I know. They rose as the hallway doors swung open. The bailiff stood at the threshold, calling Xavier's name. Xavier Thompson, Courtroom 2B. As Xavier stepped forward, Samuel at his side, the tension lingered in the hush of the corridor. Collins watched them go, still leaning against the pillar, that chain's faint reflection shimmering where his fingers had brushed it. Xavier felt every eye in the hallway on him, some curious, some sympathetic, some cold. Few offered the nod or smile he would have welcomed. Many pretended not to notice. But Xavier didn't need their support. His chain warmed against his chest, a quiet reminder of the bond that not even this deputy could sever. With every step toward the courtroom, he repeated his grandfather's words, kalos kagathos, noble and good, in his head. He would meet this challenge with the same calm dignity that had carried his family through darker times, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand your ground and let your truth shine. And as he crossed the threshold into Courtroom 2B, the air shifted once more, from suspicion and threat to the heavy anticipation of a young man who refused to be broken. The real test was about to begin. Xavier stepped into the wood-paneled courtroom, the click of his dress shoes echoing in the hush. He and his grandfather, Mr. Samuel Thompson, paused just inside as the bailiff called his name. The polished mahogany defense table was empty except for his public defender's briefcase. Across the aisle, Deputy Collins leaned against the prosecution desk. Xavier felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but he held his posture straight and his shoulders squared, just like his grandfather had taught him. At the front, the bench rose like an altar of authority. Behind it, the judge's chair sat empty, robes folded neatly over its arm. Xavier's palms felt slick, but he kept them flat on the table in front of him. His attorney, a bright young woman named Marissa Holt, gave him an encouraging nod. Across from her, the assistant district attorney tapped through her notes on a tablet, and standing by her side, still clutching the chain, was Officer Collins, as confident as ever. A hush settled, punctuated only by the soft scrape of a chair as the bailiff announced, "All rise. The Court of Pitkin County is now in session. The Honorable Celia Thompson presiding." Xavier felt his breath catch. Judge Thompson, the figure of calm impartiality, stepped into view. When she donned her gavel-bearing robe and sat, the courtroom exhaled a collective, reverent breath. "Please be seated," she intoned, her voice cool but kind. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind the last latecomer, Xavier caught her eye for a split second. Under those robes was the woman who had guided him through scraped knees and math homework, his mother. He let that small reassurance settle in him. Assistant D.A. Connors stood and began the hearing briskly. "Your Honor, we are here on the matter of State v. Xavier Thompson, docket number AA 202517. Mr. Thompson is charged with trespassing and disorderly conduct arising from a school incident. We intend to present a swift case, absent any aggravating factors." She flipped to her first note, avoiding any glance toward Collins and the chain. Xavier's lawyer rose next. Your Honor, we move to dismiss the disorderly conduct charge, as there is no evidence of wrongdoing by my client beyond a simple misunderstanding. We respectfully request a brief discussion of the underlying facts before proceeding. She settled back, giving Xavier a small, confident smile. Judge Thompson nodded, then looked at Collins, who was still clutching the golden link. Her gaze lingered on that little loop of metal. Collins straightened. Your Honor, before we continue, I have evidence I believe should be logged. This chain, which I confiscated from the defendant upon his arrival this morning, he held it up deliberately, the pendant catching the courtroom's lamplight. I believe it may be relevant to the matter. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Xavier's grandfather leaned forward, cane tapping lightly. But Xavier stayed put, steel in his spine. He met Collins's eyes and, without emotion, said, "That chain belongs to me." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Officer Collins," she said, voice steady, "did you have a warrant or written seizure order to take property from a minor?" Collins hesitated, shifting his weight. "No, Your Honor, but it looked suspicious, so I acted to preserve potential evidence." Her lips pressed together. She picked up a sealed envelope marked Court Exhibit 1, Property Seizure Forms. She set it aside, then fixed Collins with a crisp gaze. "Did you ever file a formal seizure report?" Collins glanced down at his polished shoes. "I was going to." Her voice sharpened. "You were going to? You took personal property from a 16-year-old without paperwork, without probable cause, and without his consent. And you've carried it into a federal courtroom without logging it. Do you realize the severity of that misconduct?" Collins opened his mouth, but no words came. The courtroom fell so silent you could hear a pen drop. Xavier felt a surge of vindication. Not triumph, but relief that someone in authority was finally recognizing how outrageous this was. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her tone now laced with the quiet fury she wielded best. "Mr. Thompson," she said, shifting her attention to her son, "you have been unlawfully deprived of property that holds significant personal value. That chain symbolizes your father's sacrifice and our family's legacy. It is not evidence of any crime." Xavier exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. Collins flicked his eyes to the judge's bench, as if noticing, truly noticing, her authority for the first time. "Deputy Collins," she continued, "return the necklace to the defendant immediately." Collins's composure cracked. He unzipped his utility belt pouch, the chain swinging like a pendulum, and he let it drop onto the defense table with a metallic click. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a verdict. Marissa Holt reached forward, gently pushing the chain toward Xavier. He leaned over, clasped it carefully, and drew it back inside his shirt. The chain rested against his heart, a calm affirmation that his story had been heard. Judge Thompson didn't let the moment fade into sentimentality. She turned to the prosecution. "Let the record show that Officer Collins violated departmental protocol and civil rights by seizing private property without cause. I am referring this incident to Internal Affairs and the state's Department of Justice for full investigation." A gasp rose from the spectators. Even the assistant DA blinked, opening mouth but only managing a whispered, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Thompson shifted once more, addressing the court. "Because of this miscarriage of authority, today's proceedings have been compromised. Therefore, I am recusing myself from further adjudication of this case to avoid any conflict of interest. The clerk will reassign this matter to another judge, and all charges against Mr. Thompson are hereby dismissed." Xavier felt the courtroom tilt beneath him. Charges dropped, judge recused, officer under investigation. None of it had been part of his plan, yet it was the only just outcome. He caught his mother's eye. She offered a small nod of pride and solidarity. As Xavier gathered his things, Samuel rose beside him. The bailiff called the next case. Collins lingered near the exit, head bowed, uniform stiff as stone. Marissa Holt paused, handing Xavier his backpack. "You're free to go," she said. Xavier stepped out of the courtroom into the bright hallway. Reporters and onlookers buzzed at the door, smartphones raised. He gave them a calm, steady glance, but didn't stop. Behind him, Judge Thompson watched from the bench's doorway, robe flowing, gavel at rest. She'd done what few judges dared. She'd put justice ahead of procedure, family ahead of fear, and sent a clear message that no badge could intimidate the truth. In that moment, Xavier realized that sometimes the quietest acts, simply standing your ground, refusing to be shaken, carry the greatest power. And as he walked past the stunned officer and into the sunlit corridor, he knew this was only the beginning. The ripple had formed in the courtroom's stillness, but soon it would become a wave no one could ignore. By the time Xavier and his grandfather stepped back into the bright sunshine of the courthouse portico, the ripple effect of that courtroom confrontation was already in motion. Reporters jostled for position at the entrance. Cameras clicked from every angle and deputies hurried by with urgent whispers. Xavier's legs felt unsteady. He'd expected relief, but instead he felt like the eye of a storm, calm but surrounded by churning winds. "Come on, champ," Samuel said, guiding Xavier toward the old station wagon. "Let's get you home." Inside the car, Xavier sank into the seat, chain still resting heavily against his chest. Samuel started the engine but didn't drive right away. He turned in the seat, fixed Xavier with a knowing look. "You know they're going to set off fireworks over this," he said. "Social media's lit up. They already posted the clip of Collins snatching that chain." Xavier nodded, throat tight. "People are calling it everything from abuse of power to racial profiling." He paused, then added quietly, "Even some of the school kids are tweeting, 'Justice for X.'" Samuel let that sink in. "You really think it'll stick?" He did. By noon, hashtags were trending on every major platform. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even local Nextdoor forums were buzzing. The grainy 10-second clip of Deputy Collins yanking the golden link off a 16-year-old's neck had gone viral. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, some outraged, a few defensive on Collins' behalf. But the dominant voice was tired of watching authority figures overreach and walk away scot-free. Meanwhile, inside the Glenwood Springs Sheriff's Department, internal affairs was moving at warp speed. Captain Laura Martinez, herself a 20-year veteran, stared at her computer screen in stunned silence. She'd barely recovered from the morning briefing when her phone buzzed with an alert. IA Case 2487, Thompson Incident. She clicked open the folder. Collins's entire record was laid bare. Prior citizen complaints, disciplinary warnings, dozens of traffic stops. A pattern was emerging, and now the department couldn't ignore it. Martinov called Collins's office at once. His desk sat empty, the chain he'd confiscated nowhere to be found, presumably returned in the courtroom. She left a curt voicemail. "Deputy Collins, report to my office in 15 minutes. We're opening an official investigation. Bring any and all documentation you have related to the Thompson case." Then she paused, took a breath, and added under her breath, "We're going to get to the bottom of this." Back at Xavier's house on Cedar Avenue, the front yard was alive with activity. Neighbors paused on their porches to watch Samuel help his grandson out of the car. A journalist from the local paper stepped forward, recorder in hand, asking for comment. Judge Celia Thompson descended the driveway in sensible flats and a blazer, her robe still folded over her arm. She crossed the yard in long strides, stoic but not unkind. "Mom, Dad," Xavier said, voice small. "Xavier," she replied, giving him a quick hug, "you handled that with more grace than most adults could muster." She straightened, then turned to the reporter. "We'll have an official statement released later today." With that, she guided Xavier and Samuel inside, leaving the press corps to speculate on her words. Inside, their living room had transformed overnight. Piles of thank you letters from strangers, bouquets of flowers, and a stack of printed news articles covered the coffee table. A baker down the street had delivered a lemon cheesecake with a note, "Thank you for standing up." A group of high school students had sent a framed photo of Xavier on the courthouse steps, hashtag scrawled in bold marker. Xavier sank onto the sofa beside his mother. She sat next to him, placing a hand on his wrist. "How are you holding up?" she asked. He shrugged, eyes on the floor. "I didn't expect it to get this crazy." She smiled ruefully. "Change seldom arrives in a quiet package, but you sparked a conversation that's overdue." She squeezed his hand, then stood. "I've got to head back to Chambers for a quick debrief. Your grandfather and I will meet with the city council and the sheriff later. You rest, okay?" Samuel ushered Xavier to the den where textbooks were scattered on the desk. "Fancy a game of chess?" he asked, pulling out a well-worn board. Xavier offered a small grin. He lifted the chain, rolled it between his fingers. That afternoon at City Hall, a special session of the Public Safety Committee convened. The mayor, flanked by council members and community leaders, leaned forward under the glow of fluorescent lights. "We cannot ignore what happened in our own courthouse," she declared. "By tomorrow, I want clear recommendations for increased oversight, bias training, and a transparent review of all complaints against our officers." Across the table, Judge Celia Thompson sat as an invited guest, not presiding but making her voice heard. "As members of this community, we owe every citizen the presumption of dignity," she said. "My son's experience was not an isolated misstep. It reflects a systemic failure. Addressing it demands more than apologies, it demands action." A councilman shot a glance at the local police chief in the corner, whose stiff nod signaled his agreement, despite the storm rocking his department. The chief cleared his throat. "We will cooperate fully," he said. "Inspector Martinez's internal affairs inquiry will expand to cover similar incidents over the past 5 years. By the time the session adjourned, a task force was formed, composed of city officials, law enforcement, judges, and community advocates. Their mission: restore trust in the system, hold everyone accountable, and ensure no teenager ever endured what Xavier did. As dusk settled, Xavier returned home to a quiet house. He sat on his front steps, chain tucked safely beneath his shirt. Samuel joined him a moment later, cane clicking softly. They watched the streetlights flicker on, casting long shadows. "Think it'll make a difference?" Xavier asked. Samuel studied the sky where the first stars were emerging. "I've seen too many cases drift away, buried under file cabinets and forgotten." He paused, then turned to Xavier. "But this time, they can't look away. They'll see the faces behind the statistics. They'll hear the stories behind the data." Xavier nodded, letting his grandfather's conviction settle into him. The chain around his neck felt less like a burden now, and more like a torch passed down to him, one he must carry forward. In the days that followed, Xavier's story spread beyond Glenwood Springs. A national news outlet featured the viral clip, juxtaposing the brutal grab with Judge Thompson's measured, decisive judgment. Civil rights groups issued statements praising the family's courage. A local activist organized a community forum where Xavier was invited as the keynote speaker. Standing behind a lectern in the church basement, Xavier cleared his throat. Under the warm glow of string lights, faces young and old leaned forward, eager to hear him speak. He touched the chain at his throat, then met their eyes. "I didn't plan to become anything special," he began, voice firm but clear. "I just refused to let someone take something from me without cause. That chain isn't just gold. It's my father's legacy and my family's story, and when it was ripped away, I realized how quickly power can strip a person of dignity. But when you stand your ground and let the truth speak, you show everyone what real courage looks like." The crowd erupted into applause, not loud but wholehearted, the kind that carries weight. Xavier let that moment wash over him. He'd started this journey as a kid coming to court to clear his name. Now he was a catalyst for change across his town and beyond. By month's end, the sheriff's department had placed Officer Collins on administrative leave, pending a formal hearing. 3 other complaints against him, once shelved, were reopened. The Public Safety Task Force unveiled a community-led oversight board to review future incidents. And in a small ceremony at the courthouse entrance, the mayor presented Judge Thompson with a commendation for her unwavering commitment to justice. Xavier watched from the sidelines as his mother accepted the honor. He felt a surge of pride and something deeper, a sense of purpose he'd never known. The chain around his neck didn't just connect him to his past, it anchored him to a future where he could stand up for others who lacked a courtroom powerful enough to bear witness to their dignity. That evening, back on his front porch, Xavier sat alone under a sky streaked with sunset. The chain lay heavy in his palm. He closed his hand around it, feeling its cool heft, the ridges and smooth curves shaped by fire and memory. He whispered to the quiet night, "I won't forget. I'll keep standing." And as the porch light flickered on, illuminating his determined face, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey where justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a promise he carried in every step, every heartbeat, every golden link that refused to be stolen. The days after the courthouse showdown felt electric in Glenwood Springs. By sunrise on Friday, news vans lined Maple Avenue, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, beaming the viral clip of Deputy Collins yanking Xavier Thompson's gold chain to living rooms across the country. Even at 16, Xavier understood he'd ignited something bigger than himself. He and his grandfather, Mr. Samuel Thompson, still stoic in his fedora and leaning on that familiar carved cane, slipped quietly through the garage door. Inside, a growing stack of mail awaited, letters of support from classmates, messages from strangers thanking him for having the courage to stand his ground, and one crisp envelope embossed with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. "Looks like they took notice," Xavier murmured, sliding the chain back under his shirt as he opened the envelope. Inside was a notice, an invitation to provide testimony for an ongoing federal civil rights investigation into the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department. Xavier looked across at Samuel, whose eyes brimmed with pride and something deeper, resolve. Later that morning, Xavier stood before a buzzing assembly in the high school auditorium. Seniors who'd once shrugged at him in the halls now whispered and pointed, some with fist-raised solidarity, others with respectful distance. A banner above the stage read, "Welcome Student Leaders." As his mother, Judge Celia Thompson, had suggested, the school district's new Diversity and Inclusion Committee had asked him to share his experience, just the facts, they'd said. Nothing more, nothing less. He took a steady breath. The hush fell. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than some might have expected, but each word carried the weight of hard-earned truth. "I walked into that courtroom to clear my name," he began. "I never thought one chain could be so powerful. But when they tried to take it, they weren't just yanking metal. They were yanking at my identity, at the memory of my dad. And when you strip someone of that, you're left with a choice. Do you shrink back, or do you stand your ground?" Heads nodded as he continued. The audience leaned in, captivated not just by the story, but by the calm conviction behind it. That afternoon, a community forum convened in the town's oldest church, a stone building built in 1892, its stained glass windows now casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the wooden pews. Local activists, faith leaders, and concerned citizens packed the sanctuary. Xavier's mother took the podium first, detailing the policy changes already underway: mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the creation of a civilian oversight panel, and a streamlined complaints process that no longer allowed allegations to vanish into bureaucratic black holes. Then she introduced Xavier. As he stepped into the spotlit aisle, the chatter hushed to a respectful silence. On the front row sat elderly neighbors who'd watched him grow up, young mothers clutching infants, and students scribbling notes on smartphones. Xavier recounted his grandfather's advice: stand tall, but do it with dignity. He spoke of the chain's journey, from the rubble of that fateful fire to its moment on the courtroom bench, and how, in that pause, he saw the power of presence. When he finished, the applause was unhurried but deafening, filling every crevice of that sacred space. Meanwhile, back in City Hall, officials had gone to work. The Public Safety Committee held emergency sessions. The sheriff's department released interim leadership plans, and the press conference with the mayor and council members, streamed live on every local station, culminated in a pledge to audit all past complaints, to appoint a permanent civil rights liaison, and to restore community trust. Every promise was met with cautious applause, but Xavier and his family knew that true change would be measured in months, maybe years, not in headlines. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, Xavier returned home to find a single photo leaning against the door. Him, in his crisp white shirt and slacks, standing before Judge Thompson's bench with the chain visible under his collar. On the back, scrawled in felt-tip pen, "Thank you for breaking the silence." He slipped the photo inside his backpack and closed the door. In the days that followed, Xavier's life settled into a new rhythm. He continued classes, played chess with Samuel in the den, and helped his mother review case files in the evenings, now more as an eager apprentice than a nervous teenager. He even agreed to join the School Board of Student Advocates, where he pushed for peer-to-peer training on bystander intervention and bias awareness. At church on Sunday, he knelt beside Samuel as they watched light filter through the rose-colored panes. "You think it'll stick?" Xavier asked quietly. Samuel tapped his cane against the pew. "Movements aren't built in a single day," he replied. "They're built one person at a time, one story at a time. You did your part, now the rest is up to all of us." Soon after, Xavier was invited to speak via video link at a statewide youth justice summit. On screen, he shared the shortened clip, pausing it at the moment Collins's hand lunged for the chain. "That's the moment you decide whether to shrink or stand," he told the camera. "I chose to stand." By the time fall turned to winter, Officer Collins had been placed on administrative leave, pending formal charges, and 3 dereliction of duty complaints had resurfaced, no longer buried in dusty files. The sheriff's department unveiled a new transparency portal where citizens could track the status of every complaint in real time. Xavier's story even caught the attention of the state legislature. A bill mandating statewide anti-bias certification for law enforcement passed with overwhelming support, one of the first laws of its kind in Colorado. While he never sought the spotlight, Xavier's name became synonymous with quiet courage, a reminder that real power sometimes lives in the simplest act of refusing to be erased. On his 16th birthday, Xavier's family surprised him on the front porch, a gathering of neighbors, classmates, and local officials. In his hand, he held the restored chain, polished and gleaming. Judge Thompson, no longer just a mother, but a symbol of both justice and compassion, clasped it around his neck. He looked out at the faces gathered, some smiling, some teary, all bearing witness. "This chain isn't just mine," he said, voice filled with warmth. "It's ours. It belongs to every person who's ever felt unseen or unheard. And as long as I wear it, I'll remember why it matters to stand tall, even when the world tries to pull you down." As the camera pulled back, capturing the circle of support around him, Xavier realized that his journey wasn't about a single chain or a single courtroom. It was about the ripple that one moment of dignity can send through a community, through a state, through a nation. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new battles for fairness, new fights for respect, Xavier knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't shrink. He'd keep standing, chain at his heart, eyes forward, voice steady, until every person who had ever been diminished found the courage to do the same. Because in the end, justice isn't just about passing verdicts or changing laws. It's about the stories we choose to live and the stand we refuse to back down from. As the sun sets on Xavier's journey, from a nervous teenager in a courtroom to the catalyst for real reform, it's clear that true strength doesn't roar, it stands. His refusal to let a single gold chain define him rippled out into policy changes, community conversations, and legal safeguards that will protect countless others. What began as one boy's quiet act of dignity transformed into a powerful reminder: when we refuse to be invisible, we force the world to see us. The lesson? Courage often looks like calm resistance, holding your ground without aggression, insisting on your humanity when others try to strip it away. Every act of quiet defiance against injustice matters. It doesn't require shouts or violence, just the conviction to stand tall and let the truth speak for itself. You don't have to change the whole system in a day. You only need to spark the first flicker of awareness, and that spark can grow into a blaze of accountability. If this story inspires you to hold your own ground, respect others' dignity, and remember that presence itself can be revolutionary, let me know. If you enjoyed this video and its message, type 1 in the comments. If you think it could be more engaging or you have ideas for improvement, type 0. I'm here to make each story more compelling. Thank you for watching, and remember, standing still can sometimes be the bravest move of all.